Welcome. We're super excited. My name is Jerry Bowers. I'm the Director of Development here at the MDI Biolab. I see a couple of new faces in the audience, so welcome. And we are very excited to welcome Dr. Susie Arnold to our Science Café forum this afternoon. And Susie is going to be talking with us about some ideas. She is part of a collaborative project with the Island Institute and Bigelow Laboratory, as well as some members of the aquaculture industry, to look at whether or not it's possible that growing kelp might help mitigate some of the ocean acidification issues associated with shellfish farming and that sort of thing. I'm probably doing a terrible job of picturing what you're talking about. But we're really excited to, number one, have Susie here. I think this is the first time we've had anyone from the Island Institute to speak at our Science Cafe, so we're really excited to think about maybe what might be in the future too and some more collaborative opportunities. But please join me in welcoming Susie, and we look forward to hearing what she has to say. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me. So I plan to talk for about 25 minutes-ish, give or take, and I welcome questions. So if you have questions, if I'm going too fast, if you want to stop me, go ahead and interrupt me. I don't have a problem with that at all, but know that we will have plenty of time afterwards for questions. Again, my name is Susie. I've been at the Island Institute as their marine scientist for almost 8 years now, and I work there on climate change, how it impacts fisheries in the Gulf of Maine, and how it impacts fishing communities in the Gulf of Maine. So today I'll be talking specifically about a collaborative research project that I have. The title of my talk is Kelp Farming as a Potential Strategy for Remediating Ocean Acidification and Improving Shellfish Cultivation. And like was mentioned previously, this is a very collaborative project. I work very closely with Nicole Price at the Bigelow Laboratory for Ocean Sciences and her technician, Brittany Honish. We work very closely with the University of New Hampshire and Joe Salisbury's lab down there. We also work very closely with 2 industry partners, including Atlantic Sea Farms. They used to go by Ocean Approved. They're the kelp farm. They no longer farm their own kelp, but I'll get into that later. During the time of these 3 years of research, they were farming their own kelp. Now they're a processor and work with individual farmers. And then Bangs Island Mussels, we work really closely with Matt Moretti, who is owner of that company with his father. So just a little bit of background, if you didn't get an earful about the Island Institute when you walked in, I'll just, for those of you who haven't heard of us, we are based in Rockland, Maine. We've been there for over 35 years. We're a community development organization, and we work with Maine's 15 unbridged islands that have year-round communities, and also we have expanded our mission over the last several years now to include all of the coastal communities in Maine. So we're very busy with over 3,500 miles of coastline. Oops, this is what I was worried about. Some of these slides hopefully will stop advancing at 30 seconds, but we have 3 strategic priorities in the Island Institute: strengthening community economies, enhancing education and leadership, and delivering and sharing solutions. And under these core priorities, we have a number of different teams. So I'm the only marine scientist on staff. We have other teams that focus on sustainable energy. We have teams that focus on getting broadband out to coastal communities. And we have teams like the Sea Level Rise Resiliency Team. So we work in a whole different number of areas. And I pretty much handle all the marine science questions and work predominantly on sea level rise issues, aquaculture, lobster, ocean acidification, any kind of climate impact that impacts fisheries in the Gulf of Maine. So just to get to dive into why the Island Institute is interested in ocean acidification. Sorry, this microphone, I'm just going to move it a little bit away. It's very distracting for me. There we go. So why is that okay still? All right. I'm not blasting myself out of the room. Why we're interested in ocean acidification is because our coastal communities here on the coast of Maine, as you guys probably already know, are heavily dependent upon fisheries, specifically the lobster fishery. So this slide here is taken from, I know it's very data heavy, but I'll take a minute to explain it. It's from our Waypoints publication, and Kelsey has brought the most recent publication of waypoints from this year. You guys are welcome to take a copy. This is from the publication a couple of years ago that shows essentially the economic importance of lobster to Maine's coastal communities. And those circles are highlighting the top 10 ports in terms of landings value. And then, so the landings value is the dollar figure on top, and the percentage is the percent of residents in that community that hold lobster licenses. So you can see that in some of these island communities, there's a disproportionate dependence upon this fishery here. To put it into context, we like to use this fun fact. If you look at the landings value from the top 3 ports, and this is 2015 data, so if you look at Stonington, Vinyl Haven, and Harpswell, those 3 communities combined landed about $123 million of lobster in 2015. If you take the total landings value of all commercial fisheries in the 3 New England states of Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New Hampshire, it equals $123 million. So just to give you an indication of how important lobstering is to the Maine communities. To look at these data kind of a different way, these are landings values from 2018. You can see we have this heavy dependence specifically on just lobstering. 76% of landings by value come from this one shell fishery. But we also have a heavy dependence on other shell-building species. So scallops, urchins, oysters, soft-shell clams, all of these species secrete shells and are going to be vulnerable to ocean acidification. So that's why the Institute is concerned about ocean acidification and its impacts on Maine. Now, rather than dive into a scientific lecture about the science of ocean acidification, I'm going to show you a 4-minute animated comic on the topic. And I think it will suffice, and you'll all be experts after that. And maybe you'll get a laugh out of it, too. So this comic, it's called The Climate Calamity in the Gulf of Maine. Has anyone seen it already? Okay, a handful, but not too many. That's good. So this was paid for by a Maine Sea Grant and the Northeast Coastal Acidification Network. And it was produced by O-Chang Comics, which is a small animated comic company that is a husband and wife out of Lincolnville, Maine, so they're local. They are most well known for a Temp Tales series, which is poking fun at kind of down east culture, and you can YouTube it. But they have also produced a few environmentally focused comics on climate impacts to fisheries in the Gulf of Maine. We recently hired them to create one on sea level rise. So if you haven't seen that one either, I really recommend that one. That's a little bit longer. There's one on warming waters and there's one on green crabs. So I'm going to show you this one. If it's too loud, just let me know. And the reason why we like to work with O-Chang, I'm going to throw this in here too, is because they reach an audience that might not normally click on a scientific documentary. So we feel like them as the messenger is able to reach a broader audience than if we were to produce a, talking head of a scientist talking about ocean acidification. Hang on a second. Technical difficulty. This did work. So there's hope.
Massachusetts, down to the tip of Cape Cod, make up the boundaries of the Gulf of Maine. The Gulf is known the world over for its flourishing populations of shellfish, mammals, and seabirds. For hundreds of years, the Gulf's bounty has fed the region's inhabitants, provided thousands of jobs, and sustained the unique cultural character of its coastal communities. But as humans continue to burn fossil fuels to power our global industrial economy, the Gulf's marine ecosystem has become threatened by the warming ocean temperatures and the changing chemistry of the air. While most of the carbon dioxide burned from fossil fuel stays in the atmosphere, about 25% of it goes into the ocean, which is why we call it a carbon sink. The big problem is that when CO2 goes into the ocean, it reacts with seawater to form corrosive carbonic acid. As the carbonic acid breaks down, it releases hydrogen ions, which combine with carbonate in the water, inhibiting the formation of the vital molecule calcium carbonate. Creatures like clams, lobsters, mussels, shrimp, scallops, oysters, sea urchins, and corals use calcium carbonate as the building blocks to form their shells. With fewer calcium carbonate molecules, they have to spend more energy for shell production, which hinders their ability to grow. If the water gets too acidic, it could even dissolve their shells. Scientists also believe that the Gulf of Maine is especially vulnerable to acidification because of the complex flow of freshwater from the region's many large rivers, as well as cold freshwater from the Gulf of St. Lawrence and snow and ice melt brought down from the Arctic by the Labrador Current. Because carbon dioxide is more soluble in water, and freshwater with lower concentrations of carbonate and calcium ions, the region's unique geography further exacerbates the acidifying effect. Scientists also worry about nutrient loading, which is when the waste nitrogen and phosphorus from sewage, livestock, fertilizers, and various industries run into the ocean, stimulating massive phytoplankton blooms. Excessive phytoplankton produces even higher levels of CO2 as they decompose, which makes the waters more acidic, especially around coastal mudflats and salt marshes where mussels, clams, baby oysters, and other sea larvae thrive. Rain and snowfall also increase the level of runoff that brings nutrients into the Gulf, and the warming climate is expected to bring even more precipitation to the region. With rapidly melting polar ice caps and more rain and snow, the Gulf of Maine shellfish could be facing a perfect storm of acidifying waters, as ocean acidity has already increased by a whopping 30% during the last 70 years alone. Normally, the ocean waters would be able to take in all that CO2 without too much trouble. But because the chemical changes are happening much, much faster than any naturally occurring changes in the last 200,000 years, many scientists believe the ocean life may not be able to adapt to it fast enough. And although ocean acidification may be more harmful to some marine animals than to others, the Gulf of Maine is an intricate food web. The death of one species may cause permanent changes to the entire Gulf's marine ecology. But this time, we can do something about it. In addition to taking action on reducing CO2 emissions, we also need to learn more about the causes and impact of ocean acidification on our most treasured Gulf of Maine resources and our way of life. Humans may have contributed to the acid in the oceans, but we can also take steps to stop it. To find out more, visit www.nearcoast.org/NECAN.
Okay. There we go. Okay, so that's O Chang Studios. I highly recommend their other animated comics. Like I mentioned, we've got this heavy dependence on lobstering, which is a shell builder. We've been hearing concern at the Island Institute about how ocean acidification is going to impact lobster. And until very recently, we really had very little understanding of that. We still have a lot of work to do. It looks like warming is worse for lobsters than acidification is, but it's still causing problems, but not as obvious as the ones to bivalves. So one thing that we've been doing to help lobster fishermen diversify in the face of climate change, we know that lobster populations are moving, shifting offshore, gradually heading down east. We still have pretty steady landings in like western Maine. Landings are climbing in eastern Maine. But there's concern that there could be a downturn because of warming and acidification. So we think that it's a good idea to diversify, so to help fishermen not just have all their eggs in one basket. So as a result, for the last 4 years, this will be our 5th year now, we've run something called our Aquaculture Business Development Program, where we help fishermen diversify their businesses to include shellfish or seaweed aquaculture. We don't deal with fin fish. We, for the most part, have been helping folks get into kelp farming or oyster farming. We haven't had much success getting people into mussel farming because of the high cost to get started, but we have worked with over 100 fishermen. We helped them start 33 new businesses. So it's been a very successful program, and we will be running our last training program starting, I think the applications actually close this coming week. And it will be our last training program, not because we think that the training program was bad or unsuccessful. We think it was quite successful, and we feel now that there are enough local experts in communities where they can share their knowledge with other, so local leaders in the fishing community that can share their experience with growing kelp or growing oysters with their community members who might be interested. So they can learn from each other rather than learn from us. So we have also been hearing from these folks, well, if you think that we should diversify because of climate change, why would we diversify into another shell-building species like oysters or mussels if they are going to be impacted by warming and acidification, and perhaps even more by acidification? And we feel like, well, that's a really good point. Let's check into that. Let's figure out, is there any kind of local remediation strategy that we can employ going forward if in a decade or two shells are becoming brittle as a result of acidification? So I'm going to spend the bulk of my time talking about this pilot project. I'm going to dive just briefly into a little bit of policy here, because I think that Maine has been a success story in a couple ways. Back in 2014, we were the second state in the nation to create something called an Ocean Acidification Commission. So there was a big movement in 2014 led by fishermen themselves as the spokespeople during an administration that frankly wasn't very proactive in terms of climate change. And because of that, we really had fishermen as the voices saying, we need to understand what ocean acidification is doing to fisheries in Maine. We really just need to turn the headlights on so we can have an awareness how it's going to impact us. As you saw in the video, the Gulf of Maine is vulnerable from both an environmental perspective and an economic perspective. So fortunately, this bill got through the legislature. It was not signed by Governor LePage, but he did not veto it. So we were the second state in the nation to have following the Washington State's Blue Ribbon Commission, to have a legislatively established commission to look specifically at impacts on ocean acidification. So these are the top goals coming out of that report, which was released in January of 2015. I was on that commission, and so there's 6 goals. Obviously, we need to invest in capacity to understand the impacts of acidification. Number 2, reduce the emissions of carbon dioxide. That is the primary source, so that's obviously up there. Number 3 was identify and reduce local land-based nutrients and organic carbon that contribute to coastal acidification, like you saw in the video. Number 4, increase Maine's capacity to mitigate, remediate, and adapt, which is really the recommendation that I'm going to be focusing on most in this talk. Finally, but 5th, a goal around education. So the need to do a lot of outreach and education to inform the public about the threats of acidification. And then finally, to maintain a sustained and coordinated focus on ocean acidification. So the hope of this commission was, and we drafted a bill and put in front of the legislature to create an ongoing body that was sanctioned by the state to keep that sustained and coordinated focus. That bill did not make it through the legislature. So there was support for this short-term commission, but not support to have this ongoing body to keep a focus. We didn't stop there, though. Just because that didn't get through the legislature, we decided, and this is another success story of Maine, what a small state can do even with an administration that might not be supportive. And that was to create a public-private partnership. So in 2015, we created the Maine Ocean and Coastal Acidification Partnership. This partnership is still in existence. We meet several times a year. I was chair for a couple years. I've handed on the reins to Ivy Frignoka at Friends of Casco Bay. She handed on the reins to Esperanza Stancioff at Maine Sea Grant. So it's really been a great example of what you can do as a volunteer partnership. We have participation from the key state agencies, so it's not like the state's not involved. They are very involved. They're just not leading the charge. This partnership was very influential in crafting what is now the Governor's Climate Council. So it kind of remains to be seen if that Climate Council will absorb MOCA, if MOCA will continue. It kind of depends on the outcome of this year of the Climate Council meeting. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Maine Climate Council at my last slide here. So I wanted to talk for the remainder of my presentation on how the pilot project that I'm going to be talking to you about is a direct response to this recommendation coming out of that goal around remediation and adaptation. So it says here, because plants absorb carbon dioxide through photosynthesis, they have the potential to locally remediate acidification by drawing down carbon dioxide in the surrounding seawater, a process known as phytoremediation. The last sentence there is determining the benefits of co-culturing macroalgae such as kelp and shellfish should be a research priority. So the remainder of my talk is going to be focusing on how Bigelow and the Island Institute got together, worked with industry to address this very policy recommendation. So we all understand how land forests improve the atmosphere by taking up excess carbon dioxide through photosynthesis. You can think of kelp forests in the ocean as providing a similar ecosystem service. So they, like other seaweeds, are photosynthesizing, removing carbon dioxide from the ambient environment, and potentially changing the seawater chemistry around them. At the beginning of the project, the Island Institute designed this conceptual diagram to help explain to the public what we were trying to do. And so this is showing the potential for marine vegetation to mitigate coastal ocean acidification and improve shellfish sustainability. So I'm going to walk you through it a little bit. The pairing of seaweeds and shellfish that we're focusing on is farmed sugar kelp alongside rope-grown mussels. So these are mussels that would be grown on vertical lines in the water column from a mussel raft. As you can see, the blue there is decreased carbon dioxide in seawater. And so the concept is that through photosynthesis, the kelp farm will lower concentrations of CO2 in the water and improve the water chemistry for the co-located shellfish that are inside this remediated halo. So we hoped to see how the improved water quality could actually increase shellfish production and then be kind of an economic win-win for the farmer who could both harvest the kelp and have a better crop of mussels. So that's the concept, what we set out to see if we could produce in the field. So this is what it looks like in the field. This is the kelp farm that we worked at. This particular farm here, I'll show you where it's located in the next slide, but what you're looking at here is the buoys that are holding up the horizontal lines that are 7 feet below the surface. This farm has 7 1,000-foot lines that are growing 7 feet below the surface. So the approximate footprint of this farm is about 1,000 feet long by about 110 feet wide. So there's 7 horizontal lines. And kelp is seeded in the fall, around November, plus or minus a month or two, and harvested in the spring, around April, plus or minus about a month, depending upon water temperature. This has been a warm winter, so most people are looking forward to an early harvest of their kelp. And then everything you see here goes away in the summertime, for the most part. Some people are allowed to leave their mooring blocks in, so they would have a buoy left, but all of these intermediate buoys that look like lobster buoys are gone once harvest occurs. So this is where the farm was located. So this is the ocean-approved farm. They had, at that time, they had 2 farms around Chebeague. What you're seeing here is the rectangle on the right is the footprint of the farm. So basically, this is Chebeague Island here. This is Little Chebeague. That's where it's located in Casco Bay. Our experimental site was where that star is, and then we had a control site upstream from the farm, outside of the kelp farm. Basically, we tried to find a location that was upstream. Obviously, the tide is going in both directions, but according to the vectors in the flow model for Casco Bay and the response, or the feedback from the kelp farmer, that was as upstream as we could get, really, from the farm. And it had similar depth and similar bottom type, so away from eelgrass, so we weren't away from other wild kelp beds, so we're not picking up any other influence of photosynthesizers. So how we measured these parameters was using these two instrument packages here. So we had 2 cages with the same identical instruments inside of them. The one on the top is called a SAMI PCO2 sensor. It's actually made in Montana, of all places. The other one is called the CFOX, and essentially, in order to understand ocean acidification, you need to measure parts of the carbonate chemistry parameters. And the ones that these instruments are measuring are the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, pH, temperature, and salinity. And they also measure depth. And we set them to basically take measurements every 30 minutes. And we would endeavor to get out every 2 weeks. But as you can imagine, in the winter in a small Zodiac, it was challenging sometimes to accomplish that. But every 2 to 4 weeks, we'd go out, download the instruments, or download the information off of the instruments and take discrete water samples at depth where both of the instruments were moored. And that was allowing us to calibrate the instruments throughout the duration of the field season. We also did our best to estimate kelp biomass over the course of the season. You wouldn't believe how quickly this kelp grows. I mean, they seed it, it's barely visible to the human eye in November. And then when they harvest it, it can be 12 feet long. So it grows very rapidly. The growth really picks up around this time of year, actually. So I'm going to walk you through. So we used this field location for 3 years. I'm going to walk you through our goals for those 3 years and the basic outcomes of what we found. So in year 1, we wanted to measure, can we detect a difference in water chemistry? Simply, can we detect that there's a change because of the kelp photosynthesis? So is there a difference in pH and CO2 in this thing called omega aragonite inside versus outside the kelp farm? So what you're looking at here is the green line is inside the kelp farm. The black lines are outside of the kelp farm. This top one here is pH. And what you're seeing is elevated pH, which is a good thing, inside the kelp farm. This figure over here is from 2016. This shows you that those results were duplicated. This is for just a portion of 2016. And then you can see similar results were found on pH in the 3 field seasons. So that's good. That means we detected a difference in pH inside versus outside. This is what matters to shellfish here, which is called the omega aragonite. And essentially that, I think it said it in the video, but it's basically the calcium carbonate saturation state. And the calcium carbonate is really that critical shell builder for things that secrete skeletons or shells. And the 1.5 red line there has been identified by scientists as a threshold below which shellfish, especially larval shellfish, are vulnerable. So what this figure is showing you here is that if you were a mussel, for instance, inside the kelp farm, you would surpass that threshold 3 weeks earlier in the season because of that kelp photosynthesis. So that was a really positive result. You can see here the average of pH on a daily basis was 13% higher, and the average omega aragonite, or that calcium carbonate saturation state, was 23% higher in the kelp farm. So that was enough in year 1 to keep us interested. This was on a shoestring budget in year 1. With these preliminary data, we were able to get NOAA funding, and so allowed us to continue the project for another 2 years.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Going back to the other slide.
Yep.
I guess with those plus or minuses, those were truly different populations. They were separate, right?
Yes.
They were statistically different, right?
You mean
The green and the black
Yes.
are statistically different.
Yes.
So there is a difference between the two.
Yeah.
And so what you're telling me is even though the tide is flowing in and out and the water's turning around,
Yep.
you can see statistically different pHs and omega, whatever they are, in the area around
Yep.
the.
Yes, you're getting at a very important point that I'm going to get to about.
sorry.
No, that's a great segue. That's a great segue. It's kind of related to this next slide.
Okay.
And it's definitely related to the next step in our research program.
Sorry.
No, that's perfect. Thank you. So year 2 was, can we determine the spatial extent of this remediation halo? Can we determine how far beyond the kelp farm we can detect this difference in water chemistry? And this is where flow comes in. And we don't, at this time, we did not have flow meters out there, so I can't tell you, but I think probably what was happening in this picture is the flow is going in this direction. And so how we were able to kind of map the carbonate chemistry was through using the instruments from the University of New Hampshire, from Joe Salisbury's lab. We mount them. They're basically seaboard instruments that flow through. So we basically put an intake pipe off the back of the boat, going down to the depth of where the kelp farm is grown, so 7 feet below the sea surface. And we take in water while driving concentric circles in and around the kelp farm to get a picture of the chemistry of the water below the boat. So we drive very slowly. It's very boring. And this is what you're seeing here is a map of the CO2 at the depth of 7 feet below the sea surface. And so what you can see is up in that control area where that green little marker is, a higher level of carbon dioxide than kind of in the middle of the farm and then to the southwest of the farm. So I don't have flow data to back this up for this particular year, but we suspect that probably the flow was going in that direction, kind of pushing that remediation halo to the south and west of the farm. It's really hard to map this in real time, and that's why one of our research questions is to test this at a site with higher flow. And actually, this is exactly what we were going to do last year, is we had partnered with 2 folks out of Southport Island next to Booth Bay Harbor, went through our aquaculture business development program. Alex is a lobsterman, and he and his wife, Jody, turned out to be excellent kelp farmers. They were about to seed what was going to be the biggest kelp farm in Maine, 13 lines of 1,000 feet, at the mouth of the Sheepscot River. And we thought, great, that's a very dynamic environment. There's really high flow there. If we can demonstrate that there's a remediation halo in and around that farm, we're golden. You could probably do this anywhere. We think probably that's not the case. We have some colleagues out in Washington State that have tried to replicate this in the Hood Canal and have been unsuccessful because the current is just so strong out in the Hood Canal in the Puget Sound. So unfortunately, we weren't able to deploy our instruments last year because that kelp farm was destroyed by a float at an astronomical high tide. It came off its hinges, dragged through the farm, and basically destroyed the whole farm. So we don't have data from last year at that farm, unfortunately. So that would have been 2019. In 2018, we wanted to determine, okay, so we can detect the difference in water chemistry from our in situ instruments. We can kind of map this remediation halo to some extent anyway, but is it enough of a water chemistry difference that shellfish can actually benefit and know the difference? And so how we tried to get at this was through partnering with Bangs Island Mussels. They have a site that's very close to this farm at Clapboard Island in Casco Bay, and they have several mussel rafts. And so we got them a line of their mussels, and we divided it into about lengths that are about 2 to 3 feet long, and we put those lines of mussels in these cages here. These are actually oyster cages. They're not typically used in the United States, but that's what they are. They're oyster cages. And then we hung them in replicates of 3 at different locations. Smack dab in the middle of the kelp farm, at the edge, at our control site. And this one up here we called our wicked phaw site, which is a scientific term that means so far away from the remediation halo that the mussels couldn't possibly detect it. So we left them out for only 2 months at the end of the season in 2018. And then, fortunately, we had a fantastic intern at Bigelow who was very, very bright and came up with some very creative ways to look at shell thickness and density and breaking strength. And she found some results that have been very intriguing to mussel farmers. One, that the mussel shells are denser inside the kelp farm, and they are actually harder to break, the ones that were grown just for 2 months inside of the kelp farm. So this is just a quick video here. I think it will play. This is just showing you the harvest, or one way to harvest line-grown mussels, and it's just showing you that it's not necessarily a gentle process. So that's why I show it to you, and that's why these results are important to mussel growers, because they lose a percentage of their product through broken shells. You know, I know one farmer who is also a lobsterman, and so he's able to use those broken shells as bait. But for most of us, or for most farmers who don't have a source for using those broken shells, that's just a lot of wasted money, essentially, and wasted work. So knowing that the shells are harder to break if thrown alongside kelp is a really important result for industry. Which leads us to our next steps here.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Because the harder shell can mean two things. It can also be that the growth is less.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we actually found, and I don't share this because I don't have the exact explanation for the mechanism of why it is, but we found bigger meats in the mussels inside the kelp farm, which is bringing us to one of these next steps, which is the second one here, determine the underlying mechanism behind co-culture benefits. So we saw some co-culture benefits. Are those shells and meats, are the shells thicker and denser and the meats bigger because of the ocean acidification amelioration from the phytoremediation of the kelp? Or are they bigger because the mussels are eating the kelp detritus and it's providing a supplemental food source? We don't know the answer to that. And so that is definitely something that we want to look into by looking at the guts and partnering with someone who has some expertise there, which would not be me. We also, as you got to it, the first next step is testing the concept at a site with different hydrodynamics. So that was the idea for last year. What we're actually going to do this winter, and hopefully we're deploying these instruments tomorrow, or if not, then it's going to have to be next week. We're deploying them at Bangs Island mussels. And what we want to figure out with the help of Matt Moretti down there is to provide information on the best operational design of co-culturing kelp with mussels. First, to see the best benefit to the mussels because of the phytoremediation benefit, and also to add extra revenue to his business from kelp. So he became, actually last season, he holds the record for pounds of kelp harvested in one day. So he's taken to heart some of these findings, and he now has 8 mussel rafts at this one particular site and 30 lines of kelp, each 500 feet long. So that's his design for this year. I don't have a picture of the array, but if you really are interested, you could find it on the DMR website. And so what we'll be doing with him this winter is deploying these instruments in the middle of his farm and then just to the outside to try to match the flow and come up with the best design for his particular location for where he puts his kelp around his mussels. So I would like to acknowledge, before I get to my last slide, the funders for this work started out as Maine Coastal Program, CNET, Nature Conservancy, with just small bits of money to get us off the ground. As I mentioned, with the preliminary results from the first year, we were able to get money from NOAA, and then we now have money from Luke's Lobster. It's a great example of an industry who is supporting this work, and then other private family foundations. So it's really been a group effort of institutions and funding folks. So I want to leave you with just a little bit about what's happening now in Augusta. And that is related to this because really now with Governor Mills in office, we have really bitten off a very motivated agenda for addressing climate change in Maine through her Governor's Climate Council. So this is a climate council of about 40 people, but then she has created multiple working groups under that council, which consist of about another 200 people. And under the Climate Council itself is a science and technical subcommittee, which I'm on, and then I think 5 other working groups, one of which is the Coastal and Marine Working Group, which is really addressing how climate is impacting fisheries and aquaculture and how that sector can adapt and help to mitigate climate change. So there's a lot going on at the state level. As I mentioned, the MOCA partnership was, the group that started the MOCA partnership was really instrumental in informing what this council could look like. And so it's very exciting that we have this support from the governor's office. We've just released what's called our working document from the Science and Technical Subcommittee. It came out a couple weeks ago. All of the information is available on the state's Climate Council website. I encourage you, if you're interested in the state of the science on how climate is impacting different ecosystems, not just marine ecosystems, but there are talks posted from the January Climate Council meeting from experts from the Science and Technical Subcommittee, kind of summarizing what we know about how climate change is impacting different sectors of not just the economy, but of the environment in Maine. So I wanted to leave you with that, and I'm happy to take questions. Here's an example of one of our field days. So I always say, kelp farming is not for the faint of heart. Yes.
Thank you for your talk, that was great. You mentioned early on that most of the fishermen who've gotten into aquaculture have chosen oysters, yet you did your research on mussels. Just wondered why you made that choice, and are there any issues with generalizability for oysters?
Yes. Okay, so the reason why we picked the pairing of kelp and mussels is because of the habitat in which they're grown. Typically, oysters are grown on floating bags or on the seafloor. It depends on which gear you decide to use, but it has more to do with the habitat that kelp does well in. It's grown in similar conditions as a mussel farm. That's not a ground mussel farm, but is a mussel raft technique with the vertical lines hanging down from the raft. So we realized that kelp grows starts at about 7 feet below the surface, and then it extends as it grows another 12 feet below. So in the conceptual diagram, you saw that, theoretically, the bottom of like a 35-foot long mussel long line is likely to be out of this remediation halo. So it's not perfect. There are places elsewhere in the world that grow their kelp on long vertical lines. So that's something that we could experiment with going forward. But so there's other pairings that could work between seaweeds and shellfish. They are theoretical at this point. Like, it's possible that if you had, this is a very controversial issue, I recognize, but if you had a sustainable harvest of rockweed alongside floating bags of oysters, that could be a similar pairing. That's some research hopefully will be underway on that concept from Bigelow Lab. And then another pairing, and again, rockweed is not farmed, it is a wild harvest, and there, as I said, that's a controversial issue. But another pairing is, again, not a farmed species, but eelgrass alongside soft-shell clams. If Nicole Price's work has actually demonstrated in southern Maine that a cove that has a lot of eelgrass has different carbonate chemistry than a cove that is devoid of eelgrass. And so you could imagine that potentially the wild harvest of soft-shell clams in that cove adjacent to eelgrass might be less vulnerable to acidification than one in a cove that is devoid of eelgrass. So it really points to, obviously you're not going to harvest the eelgrass, so you don't get that economic win-win, but it points to the ecosystem service of seaweeds or macrophytes in this case. Eelgrass isn't seaweed, but.
A related question, not quite on topic, but in our area, blue mussels have disappeared.
Yes.
And we've asked some questions.
Yep.
People talking green crab, talking tigers, they're talking everything. Is anybody studying that, and have they come to any conclusion as to why and what the future is like?
Yes. So I actually get that question a lot. And I wrote a column in the Working Waterfront newspaper after interviewing a few scientists who are paying closer attention to that than I am. And I got a few different theories. So to answer your question, is anyone studying it? A couple people are, but surprisingly few. And there's not a ton of data. There's data from, I think it's Swans Island. And I can't remember the names of the scientists, but I can certainly refer you to the article that I wrote, which kind of summarizes my findings from talking with experts on that topic. But from what I recall, this was several years ago, from what I recall, so green crabs were definitely implicated. Foraging by humans was also implicated by someone I deeply respect, and so it's kind of hard to imagine that, people who just go out and harvest in their front yard are having an impact. But he was convinced, this is Bob Stenick's theory, I don't know if any of you know him, but he was actually convinced that that is having an impact between the green crabs and the human foraging over time. He thinks that that is having a significant impact. Some people think that, wild harvest falling over time has over-harvested. So there's a whole bunch of different factors that I think are leading to it. I think most people are in agreement that the green crabs are having a pretty big impact. But I think it's a number of different things that are impacting it. I don't think there's one silver bullet. Yeah.
How patchy is the ocean in terms of, like, if you were to look, the concentric circle
Yep.
that you made? I mean, if you moved around and did that in a few places near where you harvested, would you see other places that are wide ranging, or would they all be like the red?
It's a great question. No one's ever done that. So I don't know the answer. I suspect that it's pretty patchy based on, I would suspect in deeper water it's probably not that patchy, but in coastal areas where, if you're in depths less than 20 feet, I imagine it's very patchy because of whatever's happening on the seafloor, whether there's eelgrass there, whether there's wild kelp beds there, whether there's a phytoplankton bloom. So certainly phytoplankton would impact it in even open ocean conditions, I think. So I think it is pretty patchy, but I don't have a good answer for that because I don't think anyone's done it.
And then do they move around the patchiness? That would be kind of a cool
Yeah.
baseline study.
It would be, yeah.
Any other questions for Susie?
You didn't have any data from before introduction of kelp in any of these sites, did you?
Nope. And we've only done this at one site.
Okay.
So it's just that one
That's all
place
right.
in Casco Bay. Yep, and no data, there's very little carbonate chemistry data for the Gulf of Maine. So when it comes to predicting what ocean acidification is going to look like in the Gulf of Maine going forward, you have to extrapolate from global models, and then they don't really translate well to the Gulf of Maine because of circulation differences and ice melt, like you saw from the video. So it's really, yeah, I mean, I think it's informative. We could pose a guess as to what, like, the year 2100 looks like, but it's really just that. It's just a guess at this point.
Does rockweed have the same effect on mussels or clams or bivalves?
Yes, that's a great question. So we haven't done this study with rockweed, but it has been tested in the lab. So Nicole Price did a lab study before I partnered with her on this field research, and she tested 4 macrophyte species. I have a slide for that, but I almost put it in this talk. I should have. She tested eelgrass, rockweed, sugar kelp, and ulva, which is sea lettuce. She tested those 4 species to see what is best at taking up carbon dioxide, and she found that to a certain extent they're all good, but when you get to they basically reach a saturation state except for the sugar kelp, which was the rock star of carbon uptakers. Only the eelgrass out of those 4 would actually sequester carbon long term because it has rhizomes. But as far as uptake, it just kept taking and taking. So it will do well in a higher CO2 world.
Because where I live, there's a lot of rockweed and there are a lot of mussels.
Yeah, that's good.
Just curious.
Yeah.
To kind of follow up on that question, in regards to those 4 plants, we talked about taking CO2
Yep.
from the ocean. There is an increased interest in harvesting the wild growing rockweed, ascophyllum.
Yes.
Obviously, the conversation and the talk that you presented talks about growing sugar kelp for an economic value, for value, and to help with the CO2. But I'm wondering, with this now economic issue of the rockweed, the naturally growing rockweed, if that's, I don't know how to phrase this without giving my opinion on it, but it has been helpful to sequester some of the CO2.
Yep.
Is it as helpful if it's harvested? I guess that's the easiest way to ask it. If we continue to harvest the rockweed at the rate it has been harvested lately,
Yep.
are we going to take away some of the possibilities of sequestering CO2? Thank you.
That is a great question. So, okay.
Doesn't have any political value to it.
Well, so the reason why, so sequestering would be the wrong word to use with rockweed, with kelp. It's the right word to use with seagrasses or eelgrass because it's actually sequestered in the sediments for long term. Those other seaweeds uptake carbon, and the only way to remove that carbon from the system is to harvest it. It then makes its way back to the system over the long term because in the case of kelp, you're eating it, you're excreting it, and eventually that carbon is going to make its way back into the ocean. Same thing with rockweed. If you harvest it, use it for fertilizer or whatever you do with it, it's eventually going to make its way back. So it's not a long-term sequestration answer. What it could do is temporarily remediate ocean acidification. So if you, for instance, and we could make a conceptual diagram of rockweed and oysters within the same small cove. If you did harvest rockweed, remove it from the system, it may take some of that carbon out of the system and change the water chemistry. We don't know this, we haven't tested it, but it is a potential pairing that could work similar to this. You would have to get it right where you're harvesting it in a very sustainable manner. I have heard, I don't study rockweed, I have heard that if you harvest it in a sustainable manner, it can grow back faster. Never tested that myself, so I don't know if that's true or not. But I think that gets at your question. So the other thing is, this is a very, very new area of research. It's called blue carbon. And so people are just beginning to investigate the potential of services in the ocean to take up carbon and sequester it. And so there is a paper out there by a guy named Duarte who has looked at wild kelp beds and has estimated about 15% of the biomass from that wild kelp does get sequestered in the seafloor over the long term. So you can imagine it flaking off and then getting in sediments, but I don't know what happens to the other 85%. But this is a very, very new area of research. I don't believe anyone has done that for rockweed, and yeah, so that's the best answer I have for you right now. Yeah.
Is there a commercial market for, I know there is some commercial market for kelp, but
yeah.
Is there an expanding market for kelp, and is it enough to be a kelp in the entire Gulf of Maine structure?
Yes. Yes, and yes. There is an expanding market. We just released a kelp market study. So it was on the news on
2 days.
Friday night, I think. So we can, Kelsey, do we have anything about the kelp market study on our table over there?
Your poster is on the table, but no.
Yeah, that's not in the poster. Yeah. Okay, so you could use the internet? Yeah. Because we can forward you a link to the study. It's a very detailed, long, but the short answer is yes, there is a market for kelp. That company that we worked with, Ocean Approved, is now called Atlantic Sea Farm, and they no longer farm kelp themselves, they just process it and sell it. So they're working with individual farmers. I think they worked with 4 2 years ago, and now they're up to like 15 farmers. And so they're using that for human consumption. So they make products like kelp kimchi, smoothie cubes, kelp salads. So there is a food market for kelp, and they're doing everything that they can to expand that market, and we are working on helping them do that. The processing is a bottleneck right now in terms of that fishermen can grow a lot of kelp. They're really good at it. It's just a matter of making sure we don't get out ahead of ourselves in terms of the processing and the marketing. But there's also a big push at the federal government through the Department of Energy to do large-scale kelp farming for things like bioplastics, biofuels. There's one other thing. What am I forgetting? Some other bioproduct. And food, I think. But, yeah. question over here, yeah.
Just curious about the fourth location you had, the far away one.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that right, I realize.
Yeah.
I was wondering if there was anything interesting you found or out of the ordinary you found at that spot.
No, not that comes to mind, no. No, nothing. I mean, I think that through we did multiple cruises at different times of year around to kind of map the carbonate chemistry, and we never detected anything even close to our control location.
It's pretty amazing to think that it could be so different.
Yeah, it is amazing. I mean, we were pretty surprised, to be honest, but when you see the biomass of kelp that's pulled out of these farms, it's a little easier to conceive of, especially when the instruments are right in the middle of, thousands of pounds of kelp.
But you also say it's stratified too.
Yep, it is very stratified. We found that, we did our first cruise taking water from the surface, and it was very different from when we put the intake 7 feet below the surface. Yep.
Because a lot of the CO2 is coming from upstream, is there a way that you can grow plants like in the little rivers that are going into the Gulf to stop it before it gets to the Gulf?
That's an excellent question. I guess it would depend on the scale at which you were growing and the flow that was coming out of that cove or river. I know that people are using kelp as like in a bioremediation sense. For instance, like out where the outfall pipe from a wastewater treatment facility is coming in, they'll plant, like Booth Bay Harbor is actually doing this. They're planting kelp outside of their facility, not to take up CO2, but to take up nitrogen. They're not eating the kelp, but they can do other things with the kelp. So it's not really a moneymaker. There's not a great value for harvesting kelp for anything other than human consumption at this point. It may change if the bioplastic or biofuel thing becomes a reality. As far as, I mean, I guess the answer is I'm not really sure, and I think it would be a scale. The answer would probably depend on scale, both of the amount of water coming out of that river and how much kelp you're talking about, and whether you left it in year-round or if it was just a seasonal thing you were trying to. I mean, it might align well with the spring melt and take up some of because fresh water is more acidic than salt water, so it could be beneficial at that time, and it's generally harvested in the spring, so you might see some benefit there. It could also, I mean, it depends on what your goal is. I mean, some aquaculturists might decide they want to leave their kelp in year-round and not harvest it for food. Problem, if you leave it in year-round, after the water warms up, it becomes biofouled, and you can't eat it anymore, so it's got like snails on it and other steamy things like hydroids and something you wouldn't want to eat, bryozoans, crunchy stuff.
Is that why it's harvested so early?
Yes. Yep. Yeah, because so especially this year, they're ramping up to harvest in April because the water's been warmer. They're worried about biofouling. So if it becomes biofouled, it becomes too difficult to process and have basically like a clean product to eat.
Susie, I just had a question. You touched on this a little bit in terms of next steps in the research project, but I'm just curious if you have kind of a vision of where you would like all this research to lead, what outcome you hope comes out of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just like to see more industry members benefit like Bangs Island mussels. I mean, Matt told me a story last year about, it was the first year he really ramped up his kelp supply. It was also the first year his mussel business was shut down for 11 weeks because of biotoxins. He was able to harvest all that kelp right before the closure, brought in a lot of money. He was able to keep his business going, cash flow, because of the kelp revenue during a time when he wasn't able to harvest any mussels. So that was a great outcome for him. I mean, it was kind of like this experiment, and then it paid off. So I'd just like to see, it's hard to get into mussels because it's intensive. It's monetarily very expensive to get into as compared to some of the other industries. So it's nice to have some diversity there. So I guess I'd like to see more fishermen be able to get into mussel farming, even if it's small scale, and then have them be able to buffer their product with kelp.
Yeah, what's the specific biotoxin that impacted the mussels that you referred to?
I think it was Alexandrium last summer, yeah.
Susie, thank you so much. It's an exciting project, I think, with lots of, potentially positive implications for our industries, marine-related industries. And we're thrilled to have you as part of our Science Cafe. We hope you come back and tell us how the project goes. So just two quick announcements for you. I know that many of you here are familiar with the Biolab's educational program. So we do a lot of research training. We have the largest research training program in the state of Maine. It's now in its 19th year. And it partners the MDI Biolab with 13 academic institutions, all the way from University of Maine, Presque Isle, Fort Kent, to Southern Maine Community College. And so we're trying something new this year in that while the students are here, this year we have a group of students from Bowdoin that are with us for a week. And we're partnering with Bowdoin to host a small reception, primarily inviting Bowdoin alums, but also inviting others that are interested to learn a little bit more about some of the workforce training programs that we have happening here at the lab. So Wednesday at 5 p.m., we're going to have a small reception here where we'll have the sort of 15 or so students that are with us for the week from Bowdoin along with their faculty members. And we'll have a chance to go down into the lab downstairs, into the training lab. That's really what this building was constructed for in 2017, was to really help bolster these workforce training programs. So I invite you to come join us if you're just curious about what these programs are like, what the student's perspective is on the value of these kinds of programs. We're going to try to do them more frequently throughout the coming year. We have partnerships with Colby, with Bates, with University of Maine Systems. So it'll be a fun way to, just interact a little bit with folks who have some mutual interest in research training in Maine and education in Maine. So that's one note. And then the second is if you are a trivia buff and a science buff, we have an event for you. So in conjunction with the Maine Science Festival, which will be held next weekend, the 18th through the 22nd. Okay, pending coronavirus issues. I don't know whether this is going to go on, but the kickoff for that 4 or 5 day celebration, which primarily happens in the Bangor area, is to kind of go out to the local communities and have a science trivia night at some local pubs. So we're going to host one at Jack Russell's on the 18th, and I think, is it 6?
6:30.
6:30. There might be prizes and there might be costumes, just saying. But anyway, and then again, we'll be back here for our next Science Cafe, which will be on April 13th. And that's another great discussion about scarcity of global water resources, and that's led by a former student who was here as part of our College of the Atlantic training program, a guy named Nishad Jayasundara, and he was one of our very first COA alums to go through the program. He recently received a faculty position at the University of Maine, and he's from Sri Lanka and doing some really interesting environmental research, kind of connecting to his home country and doing that work here in the state of Maine. So we're really excited to have him with us, and we hope you'll all join us. So thank you so much for being here tonight. I really appreciate it.